Welcome to our seminar on the new geopolitics under Trump 2.0. My name is Héctor Cárdenas. I'm the president of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI, and professor of practice in public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. It's a great pleasure to welcome everybody, as well as our distinguished panel, and my co-moderator, Catheryn Camacho, from the UC San Diego Center for U.S.-Mexico Studies. She's the associate director. Thank you, Catheryn.
Good morning. Thank you, Héctor, for inviting us.
So we have a fantastic panel today. Three leading experts in different areas of expertise that really need very little introduction, but I will try and do it as well. And I'm surely not going to do service to justice to their very extensive CVs, but I just wanted to very quickly introduce them to you. It's a pleasure to have with us Secretary Janet Napolitano, as she needs no introductions, very well-known leader in thought leader and in practice in government. She was the Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, as well as leading the University of California system to great heights, and formerly being the governor of Arizona. So she has a very extensive government experience and academic experience in thinking about the world and the role of America in the world, and of course, with its neighbors and partners. Thank you, Janet, for joining us today.
Thank you, Héctor.
I'm also very happy to have with us Shannon O'Neill, who is the founder of the Center for Security and who is the Director of Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations and the Vice President of the Council of Foreign Relations. Also extremely knowledgeable on U.S.-Mexico relations, but also on the role of the United States in the world. And from her perch in the Council of Foreign Relations, she has a very broad view of the role of the United States in geopolitics. And so it's a great pleasure to have you as part of our panel.
Great. Thanks, Héctor.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. And it's also a great pleasure to welcome Gabriel Casillas. Gabriel is a managing director and chief economist for Latin America at Barclays Bank. And he's a very leading economist with great knowledge of financial markets, investment flows, and will give us a perspective of the geoeconomic aspects of our discussion today. So thank you very much, Gabriel, for joining us today.
I'm honored. Thank you very much, Héctor. Very happy to be here.
Thank you. So just to our audience, welcome to the seminar, and please feel free to ask any questions that you wish using our Q&A feature in Zoom. You'll find it at the bottom of your application bar. So send us the questions, and we will be looking through those questions as the seminar goes on and choose some of those to pose to our panelists. So without further ado, I'll get started with an initial question for all of our panelists, and we will start perhaps with Secretary Napolitano. We've witnessed significant changes in U.S. foreign policy during the Trump administration. How do these changes represent a potential end of the Pax Americana, and what new geopolitical doctrine might be emerging? And perhaps, are we seeing a fundamental restructuring of U.S. global engagement, or is this a temporary deviation from established diplomatic norms that will be corrected or at least moderated in the next few months? What's your sense of how deeply these changes are affecting geopolitics at this point and the U.S.'s stance towards their alliances and partners?
Well, Héctor, I think that what we've seen in the first few months of the Trump administration is a dramatic restructuring of the United States' relationship to the world, and as a consequence, a restructuring of geopolitics overall. You can begin with Ukraine, Russia, and the tensions with our West European allies and others, Canada, for example, that really in my mind, has almost ended the post-World War II Pax Americana that you referred to. What is next? We don't really know. And that is a question because I don't think anybody has a clear view of what the Trump administration's overall global strategy is. Are we just going to fight with everybody? We're going to fight with Mexico. We're going to fight with Canada. We're going to fight with Western Europe. Are we going to continue to withdraw from international engagement, such as in the foreign aid sphere, where we had basically eliminated funding for millions, if not billions of dollars of world aid that we have been giving almost as a form of soft diplomacy? That's gone. So in a way, what we've seen is a constriction of the United States in terms of how we deal with the rest of the world. I think an open question is, how does the rest of the world deal with us? Because that too is unanswered. In terms of the second part of your question, Hector, is this a short-term blip or a long-term structural change? I don't think we know that either, but I believe we have to assume that this is going to last in some form or fashion well beyond the 4 years of a Trump presidency. It'll have a long tail because some of the changes that are being made, you just don't enact overnight and you don't withdraw overnight. And finally, I would like to say that in terms of allies and partnerships, trust is such a vital ingredient. And I think what we have seen, unfortunately and sadly, is a great diminution of trust from our allies and partners in how they can rely on the United States going forward.
Just a quick follow-up. How does this, in your experience in government, how significant a deviation is it from the way that U.S. foreign policy was conceived up to now? I mean, you've been in a lot of foreign policy discussions, I'm sure, in the cabinet in previous administrations. Is there any of what we're seeing? Are these conversations that maybe started in previous administrations, but they just didn't make it to the level of stridency that we see right now? Or is this really completely out of whack with what previous administrations have been doing?
Well, I think, first of all, we didn't have discussions over Signal in chat rooms, so just to be clear. There were discussions about the Europeans' contribution to military defense in NATO and over-reliance on the United States. And I think there is a time for some corrective measures there. What is not surprising, but not satisfactory, is going at that with a bulldozer, as opposed to through any kind of skilled strategic planning about how the Europeans can contribute more while still being able to rely on the United States. So some of those discussions were held. What was not contemplated was the kind of revolutionary change that we're seeing now in the current administration.
Thank you, Janet. Shannon, do you want to take it off where Janet left off?
Yeah, sure. Let me just a few compliments to sort of her thoughts, and I would say I do think this is a longer term shift in U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we have seen some of these tendencies throughout the whole history of the United States, right? Tendencies of isolationism as well as interventionism, right? Back to the founding fathers. George Washington didn't want to get mixed up in wars in Europe, right? There are moments where it comes and goes. And I think in this administration, in this very early days, you're seeing a bit of both, right? You're seeing isolationism, wanting to pull back and not be part of some things. And then interventionism, wanting to be parts of other things like Greenland or Canada or the Panama Canal. So you're seeing a little bit of both, which have long histories in the United States. But that said, I do think we're seeing a shift away from what has been sort of the U.S. role since World War II, right? We have changing definitions of who are allies and who are adversaries that are happening there. We are seeing changes in the U.S. interest in supporting lots of the rules-based order, right? Being part of the WTO, being part of potentially NATO, being part of other kinds of multilateral organizations there, and also being not just the funder, but actually the leader in some of the thought process. That is being pulled back significantly. And I think, frankly, we're seeing it. We have seen a real shift in where one of the major political parties in the United States stands on foreign policy writ large. It's not just Trump. It is the Republicans more broadly are questioning lots of the tenets that, the sort of icons of the Republican Party, the John McCain's or the others held. They've run away or moved significantly away. And I think that is a lasting position for, one of the major political forces in the United States that we've seen. In terms of its long-lasting effects, I agree with Janet that some of the stuff is like toothpaste. You can't put it back in the bottle, right? And whatever happens with the Russia-Ukraine war, that will probably be resolved in one way or another before the end of this term. You can't undo that if the next people coming in don't like that agreement. I think that happens with lots of different elements around the world. So one is some of the U.S. choices today fundamentally shift things that you can't go back and redo, basically. The other is, I think the world itself, and Janet sort of began this, will make its own decisions too, and will move in a direction that will be hard to undo, right? And so I look at the last, say, 5+ years on the trade front as just sort of a leading indicator of this. The United States has pulled back from all free trade agreements over the last 5-10 years. But the world has signed more free trade agreements in the last 5-10 years than in many other periods, right? Whether it's, what was the TPP, then became the CPTPP, whether it's RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, whether it's in Africa, the EU is outside agreements. There's been this huge flurry of movement that's fundamentally rewriting the trading rules around the world, and the United States is not part of it. And so I think we could continue to see that. And so whether it's bodies like the BRICS and the BRICS Plus, whether it's other kinds of elements that don't include the United States, they're going to move forward over this next 4 years, and they're not going to just, presuming another administration comes in that has a very different view of foreign policy, let's just say, which may or may not be the case given where the Republicans are as I look at their foreign policy. But even if you see a shift, the rest of the world has gone and moved forward with institutions, with alliances, with agreements that they will be, I think, reluctant to just undo if the United States wants to come back into, the world, sort of the global rules that we've had since World War II.
In fact, yesterday, Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, perhaps made, I found at least, the most clear repudiation of the U.S. Foreign policy that I've heard done, even compared to Europeans. He basically said, "We're done. We're recognizing that this alliance is finished." Is that just bluster, or is there something real behind that feeling?
Public opinion is behind that feeling in Canada, and Mark, as we know, is running for prime minister, a more permanent seat than his current, short term. But I do think there's a fundamental shift. And actually talking with Canadians that I know, and I'm sure, Janet, you've talked with some of them, as well as Gabriel, perhaps, there has been a fundamental shift there, right? There's boycotting of U.S. goods, but there's a fundamental betrayal that they feel, and they will be looking elsewhere. I think it's very hard, back to Janet's point about trust, that trust with Canada particularly has been broken more than perhaps anywhere else. But they're not alone in feeling that they've been betrayed by the United States. And, when you're betrayed by a friend, you tend to hedge your bets afterward, right? You may forgive, but you won't forget. And that changes your foreign policy behavior.
Thank you.
Shannon,
Gabriel, would you like to add something?
Before we
Yes.
move, I would like to a follow-up question that we had from the audience. Shannon, do you think this pendulum shift that you talk about in foreign policy from the United States will eventually return, or is something that is going to continue happening, not only throughout these 4 years? Do you think that will continue happening?
So I do think these trends in underlying society and politics of isolationism, interventionism, engagement, pullback, those may ebb and flow. But when they've happened in the past, you look at our 200+ year history, they've had real consequences. Some of it has gotten us into wars. Some of it has pulled us away from other aspects of what's happening in the world. And this moment and this iteration of it, I think will have long-lasting consequences, both for the United States, and if it picks up a different approach 5, 10, whatever number of years now, but also because of the way the rest of the world reacts or does its own thing, right? The U.S. comes back in a more engaged, in a constructive way, at least in my view of it, it's going to come back to a world that's a very different one than than 2023.
And I think, Catheryn, to build on what Shannon said, if we just look at, will this policy change during the 4 years of the Trump administration? Are we just seeing the first wave and then there'll be a second and a third wave? I think we have to assume that the basics will not change. Trump is who Trump is. His administration is filled with his true believers now, and I don't see a countervailing force.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Gabriel, so one of the key elements of the Pax Americana that emerged from the World War II was the global economic structures that the United States built and built with their allies. Initially the Bretton Woods Agreement, and then all of the institutions that came out of that, including the push towards globalization, the Washington Consensus, etc. As this Pax Americana sort of seems to be dwindling, are you seeing something accompanying that on the economic front, and how visible is that, and how dangerous might that be, Gabriel?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Héctor. Just one thing that, I fully agree with Janet that definitely this is a dramatic change. And one thing that Janet was saying that the dramatic change is there are some basics that will stay. Just take a look at what happened with Trump 1.0 with respect to China. And then the former President Biden continued with that. So in a different way, but continue this idea of, not isolating from China, but putting some barriers. So I agree, barriers or basic changes will still be there, despite there could be changes. And with respect to what Shannon was saying about this change, that is a long-term shift from what we have seen and with long-term consequences. Two ideas here on the economic side to tackle your point, Héctor. Just one, I think all these institutions post-World War II, it took a great deal, and it took a long time to really, really kick in and see the positive consequences. And I think we saw them in the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall. We saw it with, the demise of the Soviet Union. And then suddenly a lot of several economists started to adopt liberal democracy, capitalism. So I think we were going to the right place, globalization, variety of goods at, lower prices, wealth was actually, getting better in different places with more equality. But definitely, unfortunately, we had three events that I think changed things. No, of course, one was 9/11. The next one, of course, the global financial crisis, and then the pandemic to end things. No, so I think these three things change things, change how people in the United States and in many parts of the world take a look at this. Even though economic change was positive, if you put these three events with technology, people realize that maybe they're not as rich as they are. And of course, we can make a long treaty about why we are here. But what I want to say here is that we are here because of something, and we have to understand this cycle, that, started with all this hype on liberal democracy and capitalism and ended up with what we're right now, again, going back to get isolated, and it's not coming only from the US. And the second idea I want to mention here, trying to put these things together, is one important thing is I hope the world and the US in leading many aspects of it doesn't make the same mistakes as in the past. No, for example, if and this, of course, and if we talk about that we're coming from a very important financial crisis, and then from a big pandemic related to flu. And then we had a good years in the U.S. economy and the world. And then suddenly the U.S. government imposes tariffs. I was not talking about right now. I was talking 100 years ago, no? With the Spanish flu, with the financial crisis at J.P. Morgan in 1905. I was talking about, the roaring 20s and smooth Holly. So if we talk about that and we know how it ended, I hope we can avoid that, right now, that it looks like we're following a similar pattern. Of course, there are things that you cannot stop, like technology, the internet linkages. that we have seen. But despite that, at the end, on the services side, it's going to continue to be easy to be globalized. But on the good side, that's when we see that supply chains and the way the things can be handled. That's the part that it's really concerned. So if we think just as a bottom line of this, there's going to be a tremendous shift in terms of the goods. So demanding goods is going to be more expensive, less variety, more difficult. Maybe technology with 3D printing is going to start to change some of these things, but it seems that it's going to take some time for that. On the services side, it's going to be really difficult to stop globalization and everything. That will be my take from the economic side.
And thank you so much, Gabriel. I want to just follow up on one thing that I recently heard the Prime Minister of New Zealand identify sort of 3 trends that he saw as particularly important to keep your eyes on. And he said that the first was a shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. And we'll get back to that with Janet and Shannon in a moment. The second shift was from economics to security, where people, countries were caring before more about economics and economic ties, and now they're caring more about security ties. And the third thing was a shift from efficiency, from a focus on efficiency to a focus on resiliency. And so I wonder if you want to comment on that. Do you see the same thing from where you are?
Well, just as a start, and then you're real quick here. Yeah, definitely makes total sense. I mean, if you open up, because liberal democracy and capitalism is about opening up, and globalization. So you open up, and then suddenly you have 9/11, and you see things that bad things also globalize. So then you have the global financial crisis, and if you were in Iceland, and suddenly you lost your complete lifetime savings because somebody didn't pay a mortgage in the US, it's like, what? No. So you got hurt because of opening up. And then right now, with this very important shift in how relations with different governments are taking place, as Shannon was saying, you feel betrayed. No. So of course, if you feel betrayed and then you have bad things happen to you because you open up, well, you look for resiliency and you look for security. That's for sure. I agree with that.
Shannon or Janet, any follow-up comments on what Gabriel just mentioned?
Yeah, let me just add on Gabriel, and you look at trade over the last number of years, and indeed services have been the fastest growing, right? The goods have plateaued or even declined a bit, even before you get into all these tariffs. I tend to agree with them that services can be easier to move and the like, but my one hesitation on that is if we get into a tit for tat scenario in 2025, aka Smoot-Hawley, and you want to, already you see the Europeans, you see the Mexicans, you see the Canadians and others targeting specific districts, in their retaliation, right? They want to go after whiskey from Mitch McConnell's district. They want to go after Harley Davidsons and the like. But I think they're going to want to go after services, right? Because this is where the United States, you already see many governments in Europe talking about banking regulations and not giving them sort of financial equivalency. So that would be, hit on big banks that are in Europe. We've already seen the Europeans have, difference of opinions in terms of the big tech companies and freedom, privacy issues and other things. You could imagine that scaling up as we go forward. I mean, lots of the services that the United States provides, that if I was another government and I was thinking about retaliating, that's where I would go, because that's actually where the United States leads in terms of their trade. We don't care so much about cars, right? Europeans don't buy SUVs because they don't fit on their roads, but they do buy a lot of US services. So I guess the only caveat I put there is I think if we actually get into a kind of a full-blown trade war and you don't see negotiations away after, April 2nd is supposedly this big day with reciprocal tariffs, we'll see what happens. But if we start getting into a tit for tat, I would put services on the table for that around the world, to the detriment of many economies, including the United States.
And Shannon, that really goes to kind of the politics of trade, because the administration only talks about manufacturing and onshoring manufacturing and having a tariff policy that facilitates onshoring manufacturing, where in point of fact, where the United States has dominated and is dominant is in the services economy. And so your strategy of saying, if I'm on the other side of this, I'm going to go after the banks and I'm going to go after the financial systems and I'm going to go after big tech, et cetera. I'm glad you're not on the other side, because it'd be pretty smart.
And I mean, we ship $1 trillion worth of services around the world every day. That's one of our biggest exports.
Right.
For
Yeah,
sure.
but let me add here just one thing about the banking services. I think since 9/11, when we start to see all these anti-money laundering policies and financing for terrorism, you start to see that difficulties in terms of connecting or having cross connections between financial institutions in different parts of the world. Of course, hedge funds, big institutions are able to move around the world. But definitely in terms of like in the retail sector, it became more difficult to start, even for companies, smaller companies, to be able to do this cross-country transaction and everything. So that has already started even before tariffs and all this. Now there are services here. Just I'm not pushing back what you said, Shannon. I agree with you, and that could be an important target. But like there are many services on the side of using like certain apps or AI technology, etc. That I think is going to be difficult to add tariffs or restrictions. I mean, you can always have those restrictions, but at the end, people get like VPN and goes around them, on the technology side. So they are part of the services that I think are going to be. There are the ones that are growing the most. That are going to be very difficult to restrict.
Thank you, Gabriel. Before moving to the following question, just don't forget to ask in the in the question and answers bottom that it's below in your Zoom account. Now, Janet, you mentioned a very important word, trust. And you also talk about reliance on the United States. Shannon, on the other hand, she mentioned international organizations. This takes me to the following question. To what extent do Trump's foreign policy initiatives reflect genuine territorial or strategic ambitions versus tactical diplomatic maneuvering? How does these ambitions potentially reshape existing international alliances, trade relationships, and geopolitical power dynamics? Janet, we start with you.
Yeah, that's a narrow question. I'll start from the world I know best, which is the world of intelligence and national security. And there, on intelligence, the coin of the realm is information sharing. And so we have organizations, alliances like the Five Eyes, the UK, United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, which share intelligence back and forth. You have other alliances and partnerships which share that information. And while the United States has by far the largest intelligence operation, it is by no means an exclusive intelligence operation, and we rely on information that we receive from our partners on this. If you can't trust your partners, in terms of the veracity of what they're sharing, in terms of holding sources and methods confidential, etc., then you won't share. And that, in the end, diminishes security for everybody. So that is a key concern. When we talk about military operations, the whole issue with NATO and military forces in Europe, I think we're going to see some vast change there. I don't see it going any other direction. And I think it's one of those changes that's going to have a long tail that's going to extend beyond the next 4 years. When we talk about relations with the developing world, and the world, and when I talk about let me use another term, because I'm talking about the world outside the United States and Europe. But when we talk about relations there, our withdrawal, our retreat from international organizations, from aid programs, all of that is leaving a vacuum. And that goes to the point about, are we in a unipolar world, a bipolar world, a multipolar world? You could say that after World War II and particularly after 1989, we've been in a unipolar world with the United States as the dominant power. now we see China very aggressive on all fronts, all fronts. And so you would have to say it's really a bipolar world. What we may be seeing is actually now the creation of a multipolar world, and different alliances and partnerships being created, not just on trade, but on intelligence sharing, on military assets, et cetera. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, I don't see the overall Trump strategy. Where does this administration want to end up? It's opaque to me.
Thank you, Janet. Shannon, please.
So I think I tend to agree with Janet that I think it's a bit opaque where they want to end up sort of in long term. But I would say if I had to guess or sort of surmise, there's sort of two aspects here. One is that they're putting in lots of these policies and doing things just for leverage and power, right? This is a person who likes to make deals. And so if you get leverage other people, then you can bring them to the table and get a quote unquote better deal for the United States. So whether that's, some of the economic issues we've been talking about, whether it's security issues, whether that's, influence over other kinds of things that this administration cares about, I think there's kind of this leverage aspect that's part of the policies. But I do think this is an administration and a leader, a president of the United States, who comes in with a very different sort of mindset on the role of the United States in the global order. And it's a much more kind of realpolitik, you don't have friends, you don't have enemies, you search for power and you leverage what you have. And I think the view is that, the United States is the biggest economy, it's the most powerful superpower in terms of weapons and technology and defense and the like, and that the United States should use that to bring others, force others perhaps along on its path. So this is no longer, a shining city on a hill version of the United States. This is a much more, transactional and also kind of rough elbowed, to be nice about it, kind of way of interacting. And, in the short term, sometimes might does make right. And sometimes the bully wins on the playground, right? In that sort of sense, in the longer term, and especially when we get to issues that require, cooperation, whether that's, things like a security umbrella around the world, things like controlling nuclear arms, things like dealing with climate change, things like the global trading order. And when you get to those, then if you don't have any goodwill and friends and trust and the like, then it's much harder to push things through, right? As you said, like there's this great political scientist who had this term called the weapons of the weak. And so, yeah, you might be weak, but you don't do things. You malinger, you don't show up, you sort of, backpedal, you slow walk things. And I think that is something that we could see. You might have outright defiance. I mean, this is the question about the tariffs, tit for tat. That could be outright defiance, right? But otherwise, you just don't do the things, you don't say anything, but you don't kind of show up. And that means lots of those bigger questions or lots of those, potential, huge challenges for the world just don't get dealt with or don't get dealt with US leadership. And that in the end leaves, I think, the United States, if you're not leading, you're taking what others bring to the table and their rules and their ways of doing things. And whether that's China or others around the world, I think you put yourself in a weaker position on those issues.
Thank you. And as a follow-up question, and this is one coming from our audience, before this huge bully, what's the role of China, specifically in Latin America? What do you think about that?
So, I see China for Latin America as somewhat a double-edged sword. You look at, Chinese trade, especially for South America, has been, they become their biggest trading partner. China has bought all kinds of resources from Latin America and really helped some of those countries grow and help fill their coffers and the like. So there's been a growth that has come along with the growth of China. But that said, as that has happened, these are economies that have deindustrialized, right? So premature deindustrialization, which economists talk about, where you become less industrialized before you become rich. Latin America is a poster child for that. And some of that, there's many reasons, but some of that comes from China. When you look at Brazil today, 75% of Brazil's exports today, it's an exporting powerhouse. 75% is in 5 commodities. Most of it goes to China. And so it is struggling, Lula as president is struggling to bring back a manufacturing sector. He's putting in, some industrial policies. He's trying to bring that back. But But that is a challenge, right? So China has brought benefits, but China has also brought costs. And you look at, say, exports from lots of countries, particularly in South America. Mexico is a little bit of a different story, which I'll mention in a second. But particularly when they export to the United States, it's higher value goods, it's more advanced manufacturing. It's a more balanced relationship than the one with China, who tends to take raw materials and then send back finished goods that keep its own factories humming. And that right now, to me, is on steroids, as you see the overcapacity from China's economy. And China sent out $1 trillion worth of goods into the global economy. And much of that went into emerging markets, right? Went into these other countries, and is working on kind of eroding, if not decimating, their own manufacturing, the diversification of their own economy. So there I see, for Latin America broadly, on the commercial side, the economic side, some challenges there. As the United States pulls back, though, there's a huge opportunity for China to step in. There's an opportunity for them to step in where USAID is pulling back in terms of sort of those types of programs. There's an opportunity for China to step in on, positioning itself as the global South, part of the BRICS. If you have a bully on one side, you need allies on the other side. There's a space there. And so I think, the approach of the United States over these last 2+ months has given more space, frankly, for China in Latin America, in places where, many governments were a little bit hesitant about China. They were a little, agnostic about these costs and trade-offs. And now I think they're seeing, as the US pulls back or comes in with a different approach, that, China is an alternative to some of what's going on.
Thank you, Shannon. Gabriel, do you want to follow up on
Yes, let me chip in. Thank you. Just what Shannon, I think, depicted pretty well the situation between China and Latin America. I just want to add something that we have observed also. For example, right now in this, after the reopening from COVID, all this stimulus that China has been conducting is not coming in the same way as before, with a lot of construction going on. No, because they have built many buildings that right now are completely abandoned in a way. So they don't need to build a lot. So certain commodities like copper or iron ore, etc., the demand for those has not come with those stimulus. No. So in this context, that will not help certain countries in Latin America. So you start to see some differentiated effect. Now, for example, before Chile was really, and Peru were really, connected to China economy, and now they're not. The ones that export like more softer commodities, like Argentina or Brazil, with respect to grains, well, that's different. They have continued to export to China, and on the other side, China has now wants to flood them with like electric vehicles, no? I mean, along the same lines as what Shannon mentioned, with finished goods, etc. These companies like with BYD, etc. So, but how is this gonna hold? No, more so when China wants to grow on the inside. No, they are kind of this new mercantilism in which they want to export a lot and they don't want to import a lot except for commodities. No? So, in this context, I think that relationship it's there. I mean, you cannot break it in like quickly or anything, but yeah, it's shifting, and the reliance, particularly from the ones sending like more like industrial commodities, is changing also dramatically, because in the foreseeable future we don't see China going back to build. No, it's going to grow on other things like services. No, that's one thing. One idea I wanted to talk, and the other one about multipolar worlds. I think that's very important, because right now, financial markets usually don't stop operating with certain countries because they are blacklisted only. Of course, if that happens, they cannot. But it's not only that. For example, since all these beef started between the U.S. and China, there happened a lot of divestments from funds all over the world with China, in FDI, but also in financial flows. Started to see a very important outflows from China just because of what has been happening. And the problem of that is that then, if we are in a multipolar world, what is going to happen is also going to start to see fragmented asset classes. No? And these fragmented asset classes, usually financial markets, as you know, they benefit from diversification, opportunities for growth in certain areas, etc. So I think this is going to make the investment world even smaller. We have already seen important outflows from emerging markets, and this also will have to do with how these monies around these surpluses can help countries to grow in terms of these flows. So definitely this is not good only from a goods and services perspective, going back from globalization to maybe deglobalization. It seems that nobody wants to talk about deglobalization. People say it's just a pause or different ways of saying it. But at the end, it's happening, and I think it's going to happen also in the financial world. And that will also, if you have smaller opportunities to grow, smaller opportunities to diversify, it's going to have also consequences with respect to asset classes. I don't think we have observed the full extent of this. And right now, for example, with Russia, I think a lot of participants in the financial markets want to go back and invest there. But I think that at some point we'll start to see the extent of that more so, depending on how some things are starting to evolve, like if there's peace in Ukraine, how this is going to be achieved, everything. But that's outside of my knowledge. This is better if we hear Shannon or Janet about it.
Thank you. We have a question as a follow-up to your comments. One question from the audience is talking about income inequality. And I think this aligns a lot about what you were saying. What do you think, what's the role of foreign policy and international trade policy to close this gap and release some of the anger that is undermining the institutions established under the Pax Americana? And Shannon and Janet, please feel free to intervene as well.
I don't know if you want to start with that, or I can start just real quick. So right now, of course, I think globalization, you saw it. I mean, it was not the globalization itself, but also, adoption of freer policies and helped a great deal. A lot of people feels that there's less equality because of what happened, but honestly, if you see the numbers, actually there's more equality than before. No? So I think it was this combination of being able to feel the positive effects, but unfortunately not being able to communicate them in a good way. And that, I think that's one of the roles of foreign policy and even domestic policy. How do you really, put a weight or how do you communicate all these things? I think that's an important part that we have been missing. And just thinking that having more information, floating in the web and more access to that information would be the one that will take care, like the invisible hand in this case, the invisible information or the invisible ideas. Well, they were not just there, no. So instead of having people, checking the sources and really being able to inform better, well, a lot of people unfortunately just wants to look at the 2-minute video from TikTok and see what's happening there. So it has been unfortunate the way, all these niceties have been communicated, I think, and that's of course, it's not all about foreign policy, but foreign policy has a lot to do about it in terms of course, providing aid in terms of money, but also in terms of education. But definitely, I think Shannon and Janet can talk a lot about this.
Yeah, I think, look, in terms of globalization, certainly there is a communications failure. But it's not only communications. There have been real impacts on real families and communities in the United States from our globalization agendas, as it were, and that those impacts ultimately became part of our politics. And when you go into town after town in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and so forth, and they're just hollowed out because the manufacturing has left and it wasn't replaced by anything. And so communities that were vibrant and growing became part of what we now know as the Rust Belt, and the Rust Belt grew. And so that led to a lot of domestic political frustration and unhappiness. And I think it requires a rethinking of what globalization means and how you balance between the domestic impacts of globalization with the overall value of it.
Yeah, let me just add on to that, because there's a great study that came out recently. So back 10 plus years ago, is a great study that it's been dubbed the China shock. And it basically looks at communities and looks at the number of jobs that left the United States because of China coming WTO and it becoming this sort of trade juggernaut or manufacturing juggernaut. And, estimates anywhere between 1 and 2 million jobs that were left that ended in the United States. And so this new study by the same authors goes back to these communities and looks at what's happened to them now, not quite 20 years later, 15 plus years later. What they find is, many of these communities' jobs have come back, but not with the generation that lost their jobs the first time, right? It's younger people who have come in. It's sort of the next generation of jobs that have come in, many in the services and not. So you have a group of people who never found a path to a new job or to a job that was similar in terms of wages and respect and all of that. And so I think that is part of the real challenge that we've seen in U.S. domestic politics. And what's interesting is, there's been studies too of, which districts, that had challenges like this voted for which parties and the like. And we see sort of a shift to, the voting of today, right? So more Trump era voting. What's interesting is you don't see as many similar shifts in the European, right? There have been jobs that have left in Europe, and you look at percentage of manufacturing has come down in those countries, Germany and others as well. But you don't quite see this. So, what is the reason? Well, maybe it is social safety net, right? If you're in Germany and you lose your job, there are a lot of supports. You still have healthcare, you still have other things and the like. Maybe it's the way governments have sort of designed that part of it and the ability to shift in terms of training and the like. I would say the United States had put programs on the books, but I'll let Janet speak to them, but none of them really worked, nor have we tried to make them work. So I think those are some of the challenges. You see inequalities. It's not just in the advanced industrial economies. You see them in some of the emerging economies as well, right? You look at China today, and in cities, 20% of college-educated graduates don't have jobs. There's challenges that they're dealing with too. So this is sort of a global phenomenon. What I would say, though, is as I look at the next 5 to 10 years, right, we've been talking about trade and globalization. Some of that was technology to the start. The next phase is going to be technology, and lots of people. This inequality is just going to accelerate. And the challenges for domestic politics as well as for international foreign policy are just going to become worse. So not to leave this particular question on a sad note, but if we are worried about what happened to domestic politics because of inequality, we haven't seen anything yet. The next 10, 20 years, it's going to be very difficult, and our politics are going to have to navigate it in ways that I don't think we've been very successful at so far.
Can I add one quick thing here? Héctor and Catheryn, I fully agree with that. And unfortunately, what we see is that the diagnosis that a lot of politicians make is perfect. No? Unfortunately, the policies to solve it are the ones that are maybe way off. No? For example, one of the issues was maybe to transform a lot of the communities that were left behind because manufacturing left, it was education. No? Having better education, moving to the services industry or whatever, and that didn't happen in a really good way. And the other important part of this is at the end, if you go back and pick up tools that didn't work in the past, and you're going to use them again, because you want to address these issues, I think that's a big peril that the world is living right now. But there were some lessons learned. For example, in the global financial crisis that we saw, monetary policy, quantitative easing going ahead of, whatever it takes, rates at zero, creating money. And then, unfortunately, that increased inequality in the US and in many other parts, but particularly in the US. No? And then what happened during the pandemic? We have a more balanced policy mix between fiscal and monetary policy. And I think that the lessons learned worked well, but the damage was done. And that was very unfortunate. No? But just want to highlight that.
So that's a very good segue to our next question, which is really about if we're moving towards some kind of multipolar world. And I've heard people talk about, is it real multipolarity or is it shifting polarity, where you have different coalitions? There's not even just, hard and fast poles, but there are coalitions of countries. And you've got all of these, these ambitions from the Trump administration have to do with territorial ambitions, with this push towards the use of tariffs in a very aggressive way. Are we also witnessing, rather than the dawn of a new order, are we witnessing the possibility of very severe foreign policy miscalculations that could have an impact on all of us? And we were just hearing this from Gabriel, where if you're implementing the wrong kinds of policy prescriptions, then you shouldn't be surprised that you have some disastrous outcomes. Can we see some of that happening in other areas apart from the economic?
Well, sure, but Héctor, making policy you oftentimes don't know until you actually implement a policy whether it's going to be effective or not, or whether it's going to have unintended consequences. I think the challenge for policymakers and for countries is when you implement a policy and it's not working, to quickly recover and to do something else, and to build into policymaking kind of a theory of resilience. If how do we come back if this doesn't work? What's our next move? Policymaking is a ever evolving thing. It doesn't say, okay, we have a policy, now we fix this problem, now we move on to the next one. It doesn't work that way.
Right, but do you see that muscle, that resiliency muscle, that adaptation muscle in the current administration?
I don't, well, look, it's a new administration. I'll give it some more time. I have my doubts.
Shannon?
I think in any administration, sort of unintended consequences are always there, right? But some of these, because there's such big shifts and outside of the normal box of a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that, I think the unintended consequences are going to be much more significant. And, the problem is right here, as we talk about this now, whatever 8 weeks in or 10 weeks in, it's unintended. We don't know quite yet where they're going to go. But I would say some of the, do we see a fundamental shift and the like? I think we do, right? I mean, there's questions about, the Treaty of Westphalia, which was signed, how many hundreds of years ago, right? Our states are, borders, real borders. And, there are dozens of countries around the world that, if you look back at their long history, feel that, territory on the other side of a border is part of their history or their culture or their patrimony, let us say. So I think there is some opening up of a little bit of a Pandora's box potentially, if we see, certain outcomes with Russia, Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza, or say Taiwan and China, or other places where we have sort of this potential for, significant shifts, that could open up unintended consequences in all parts of the world. Just to put one on the table, right? If we fundamentally question this underlying, what has underlied the U.S. or the global system for hundreds of years, if that's at play, and then that leads to all kinds of sort of cascading ramifications. Just to put one thing on the table, that could be a fundamental change in the way we think about the world today.
And one thing I want to highlight here, sorry, from the financial and economics point of view, is that, at the end, Trump policies right now, if we can make a very big, oversimplification, it's about tariffs, deregulation, and lower taxes. No, let's put it just that way. And the good things that, for markets at least, or for companies, or for growth, will be, of course, deregulation, and not necessarily good in the long run, as we have seen sometimes. It depends on how it's done, but deregulation and also lower taxes, no, in a way. But then those are not coming yet, no, because need congressional approval, because need some time to happen, and tariffs are coming right now, and those are bad, and everybody knows it. So of course, markets that were really in this hype when Trump won the election have started to lose steam, and now everybody's started to getting concerned, like, okay, the good things are not coming and the bad things are coming tomorrow. No, fortunately, all these tariff things have been, except for the ones for China and some ones like this, the ones for steel and aluminum, the other ones have been postponed, paused, or in a way we call them Schrödinger tariffs, no, because they are there but they are not there at the same time. But at the end, it's if the Trump administration is able not to impose the majority of tariffs they want to, and they use them only to get everybody on the negotiating table and offering stuff, like what has happening with Mexico. Mexico in the previous administration was not cooperative with U.S. government. Now it's fully cooperative. No, I mean, just all these news that these 29 leaders of major organized crime organizations that were delivered to the U.S. I mean, I'm not going to say if it was the good way of doing it or not, but at the end, even Caro Quintero, this famous, leader of a cartel in the 80s that no president, no party wanted to deliver to the U.S., and now it's there. So there are things that are happening that if the Trump administration is able to get a lot of people in the negotiating table offering things for the U.S., that could be good if the tariffs are not end up being imposed, no? And then the good things are coming. So yeah, I will give some time to the administration, just as Janet and Shannon said.
Yeah, where Mexico is concerned, I'm glad you mentioned that, and the extradition of the 29 cartel leaders and so Caro Quintero and so forth. That was a demonstration of the use of tariffs as a threat, right? And bringing the president of Mexico to the table. And she made some moves that I think were well considered and well thought out, and from a U.S. perspective, at least, were very welcome. They don't evidence to me, however, what is the overall new U.S. strategy with respect to Mexico. I think if you're looking at the Trump administration, they have three major things that Trump thinks about when he thinks about Mexico. He thinks about the border and immigration. He thinks about drug cartels, and he thinks about NAFTA, or the successor to NAFTA. And it's probably in that order. Any kind of greater appreciation of a continental alliance or what Mexico can contribute, or et cetera, I don't think is part of his calculus. And I think President Sheinbaum would probably agree with me.
That's a good segue. We can talk about Mexico for the last remaining minutes.
Yeah, most of our questions that are in the Zoom address this following question, which is, how are this new U.S. foreign policy approach affect the North America region? Janet, we'll start with you, please.
Can you say, I didn't hear you very well. Could you say it again, please?
Sure. The question is, with the new U.S. foreign policy approach, what are the implications for the North America region, and how might the strategic relationships between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada be transformed?
Well, it's been fascinating to watch. Who would have thought 4 months ago that Canada would view us as an adversary? I mean, it takes a lot to anger the Canadians, and we've somehow done it. And that trust, that relationship, that alliance, I think will be a long time coming to be restored, even though it's been a very beneficial and important one for the U.S. from a security standpoint and from an intelligence sharing standpoint. With respect to Mexico, it's hard to say. What Trump wants is he doesn't want anybody who's illegal crossing the southwest border. So he's going to build this big border buffer zone. But what he doesn't think also is, there's a lot of trade that goes back and forth and a lot of jobs in the United States that are dependent on that trade. How about we modernize the ports of entry and install new technologies and so forth that really facilitate lawful trade and commerce? You don't hear that, but you do hear about the buffer zone. You hear about the militarization of the border, which is something else he did. With respect to the drug cartels, the big move was to declare some of them terrorist organizations under U.S. law, and that can have a lot of subsidiary impacts. And how that plays out, we don't really know. But it means, for example, that organizations that are suspected of helping people who may have some relationship with one of these cartels or whatever, all of a sudden fall under the aegis of material assistance to terrorism statutes, which have significant federal penalties. So, and that could mean organizations that facilitate immigration. It could mean banks. It could mean a lot of different things. We don't really know, but that's certainly on the table. And with respect to the overall, we had this 3-country agreement. And in fact, it was just re-upped under Trump 1. But I think, is effectively gone. I don't know if Gabriel or Shannon agree with me on that, but
yes, maybe a wrap up. We're out of time with just a couple minutes each.
Okay, what do you want to start, Shannon?
Sure. I'll go ahead. So I agree with Janet. I think, as I look at Mexico and Canada and the United States, or the North American project, or is is going to be hindered, to say the least, right? As we see tariffs come in, even if they're pulled back or lower than we think, just the uncertainty of that, this bet that Canada and Mexico were making that, nearshoring, ally shoring was going to be what they could do with the United States and form a stronger continental economy. I think that's all thrown in doubt. It's thrown in doubt because, will there be tariffs? Won't there be tariffs? What's happening on sectoral tariffs with autos, sort of a pillar all of this. I think that uncertainty will make it very hard to invest. I'd add on to Janet's on the security. And, when I've been talking with folks in this realm, let's say you lease a factory in Sinaloa. Who's your landlord? Is that landlord tied to a cartel? Then you might be, materially assisting a terrorist organization. It's day-to-day interactions get much more difficult. So you have to bring in a legal structure. It adds to your costs of just doing business in these places. So I think overall now, is it dead? No, it's not, right? North America will be there just by sheer stint of geography, of people, of the benefits, commercial benefits and the like of the back and forth. Even with tariffs, even with this layer, there's still going to be, strong connections and reasons to connect all three of these countries together. But it's just going to be harder than it was 6 months ago.
Gabriel.
Yeah, just three quick ideas here. Number one, I think it's not only North America, the way, Janet, you mentioned Trump sees Mexico. I think it sees Latin America, or maybe even a broader geographic, but that Latin America is my thing. So it's about immigration, security, and trade. No, for example, the first weeks of Trump after his inauguration, the flows of people coming to the U.S. since 2019 up to now, number one has been from Venezuela. Number two, as you know, number two was Colombia. Number three, Brazil. And President Trump had a beef with President Petro in Colombia, with President Lula in Brazil. And you move to security. How about the seaports in Panama? Or not, twisting a little bit President Molino's arm to leave the Belt and Road Initiative and be able to sell the administration of those ports to BlackRock, for example. So, it's about these things, and of course, then you go to trade. That the most important one is Mexico and Canada. But in this context, the second idea I want to see here is that I fully agree with you, Janet, that it's first security or immigration, second security, and third is trade. This is why I tend to think that even though, as Shannon mentioned, and I fully agree with that the uncertainty about this just keeps investment decisions to be postponed or definitely eliminated, and even consumer decisions to be postponed, and that's creating a very important slowdown in Mexico for sure, and even at some to a lesser extent, but in the U.S. too. I think the smart thing to do would be just to stop the idea of tariffs. I'm not sure if it's going to happen with Canada and Mexico at the same time. I don't know if there's going to be now bilateral treaties. But one thing I think the smart thing to do would be to move from the tariff threats to an early review of the USMCA. That will give some political wins to President Trump, and they will say, okay, I want the two things that he has been saying he wants is one, he wants a chapter on national security, a new one that, in order not to be at the expense of whether the president of Mexico is cooperative or not, you want, some things in print and writing. And the other one is to enforce the rules of content. So to avoid Chinese companies to use Mexico to rebrand and, jump trade barriers and get to the US. So I think that would be the smart thing to do to stop these threats and to stop this uncertainty. And of course, a review of the USMCA by itself will extend that uncertainty, but it would be to a lesser extent. And I think that would be important to start to move things up in a much better way. And still, you use the threats to get what you got, to get the things you wanted. And that happened. And then the third aspect I want to highlight here is that at the end, I think that one thing about President Sheinbaum is that a good thing is that I think incentives are aligned. For example, former President López Obrador had this nonsense policy of hogs, not bullets, that allow organized crime to expand and even overtake local governments. And Claudia Sheinbaum never bought that idea. She was mayor of Mexico City. She really was a hardliner. We saw many examples of that, and now she's applying that at the federal level. And of course, with Mexico Intel and with Mexico infrastructure and technology, it's not going to be able to do anything if it's not with the US. So I think the smart thing to do was to say, okay, we're fully cooperative with the US. And the good thing is that incentives are aligned there. And are aligned also in trade, and are aligned also I'm not sure if they're aligned in immigration, but just as a final idea here, I think the first time Trump used a tariff threat to get a non-trade related objective was with Mexico in 2019, when AMLO was saying that he will open up the country for Central American workers, giving workers visa. There was a big caravan of people from Honduras walking through Mexico to go to the US, and President Trump said, okay, I'm going to put a 5% tariff if you don't tackle that immigration. And former President López Obrador make a 180-degree turn, deploy the National Guard, invested in shelters. And since then, I think Mexico has had, in a way, an upper hand on immigration. And that's also helping in all these negotiations. No? So just want to highlight those ideas here.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all three of you, and Catheryn also, my co-host. I just want to wrap up what I heard from our panelists was, yes, there are very consequential changes in U.S. foreign policy right now, not just a change of tone, but a change of strategy. But that strategy isn't quite apparent. It's not clear to most of you what that strategy is, except that there are some key points that are perhaps we can call them obsessions or predilections of the Trump administration, and that we're having some real effects also on the relationship in North America, with a strong alienation of Canada and some realignment of Mexico and the United States on some issues, especially on the security issue. But the underlying theme I hear here is that we can be wasting a lot of time. There may be a lot of time. It'll take a long time to rebuild trust. And also, while North America is stalled, other things are happening in the world. So we should get our act together, all together, and try to make the best out of this situation. And perhaps that might be a reopening of USMCA with an accelerated schedule to review. And perhaps that's the way to get a more integral view of what the North American alliance could be, if the Canadians will go along at this point, having their egos have been so bruised and their feelings so bruised. So thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Janet and Shannon and Gabriel, for participating. Thank you, Catheryn, for co-organizing this. And of course, thanks to all of the people who signed in and joined us on this webinar and asked fantastic questions. Muchas gracias a todos. Thank you, everybody.